Hello, my name's Graham Humphreys. I'm an artist, illustrator, and my work is very influenced by punk rock, and this really kind of happened when I was at art college, which was 1976 through to 1980, which is the sort of the golden age of punk, I guess, though. And my first encounter with punk rock was through a couple of people at college who were also going up to London to see the very early Pistols gigs, and they'd completely immersed themselves in the whole culture and the look, which was quite terrifying for me at the time. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. They both wore these kind of bright orange boiler suits, like death row suits, I guess, though, but festooned in safety pins and chains and all the paraphernalia that gets associated with punk rock. Green hair, spiky hair, and I've never seen that before. I hadn't seen spiky hair before, even though. So just for a naive country boy, it was like quite a petrifying image, and I didn't understand it. Of course, one of them was a guy, the other was a girl, but they both wore the same makeup as well, which is another weirdly odd thing I'd never seen before. So yeah, as a naive young 16-year-old, it was just quite a shock to me, and yet at the same time quite intriguing. And I guess because I'd already had a love of horror films, I could kind of see how that might fit in somehow, this kind of weird otherness, and I was very much aware that other people were frightened of them as well. So that kind of actually made them slightly more interesting. And shortly after this initial shock, I actually found myself in conversation with these two individuals. One became a very good friend, and kind of realised actually they weren't frightening at all. Actually, kind of quite big, soft, lovely people, and very cuddly, and actually very unlike the image. And that's really how I began to kind of see how punk rock was beginning to move into this kind of little secret culture. That you know, the image was quite aggressive and you know, quite strident, and yet underneath that they were just very sensitive, kind of creative individuals, and that's what I began to pick up on quite quickly. And through those first couple of college years, we would play, or I wasn't playing, but in the studio I was working. The soundtrack to that period was always, it was the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, and X-Ray Specs, and a few other bands I wasn't aware of at the time. But those three bands were really the soundtrack to that kind of those early formative years. And I think by the time I'd left college, I'd sort of become a fully fledged punk, I guess, though, with the spiky hair and the clothes and such like, and even had a friend make me a sort of big yellow fun fur top just to match Captain Sensible's. I'd seen when he was playing in The Damned. Coming to London, 1980, leaving college, I started freelancing, did some work with the NME. I think I'd initially gone to Sounds because I used to buy Sounds music paper when I was at college, but they didn't seem to be interested in the work, and I think it was only through a friend of a friend that I found myself working with the NME. Somebody who was the art director at the time had already been working with a publisher on Knave and Fiesta magazine, the naughty, you know, jiggle magazines, and I'd done a couple of jobs for him illustrating some stories. So that was my inroad into the NME, and through the work I was doing for the NME I was introduced to IRS Records, who called me and wanted me to meet Steve Bators and Brian James from Lords of the New Church. And so I began working very much in the record industry, but you know, on the peripheral side of it though. So I did work with Gene October, Lords of the New Church, and a cover for the Cramps as well. So already I sort of found myself working within the music industry that I kind of really loved, and try as I might, I couldn't get any work with Susie and the Banshees, all the bands I really wanted to do work with, but you know, somehow subtly there was a little parallel world of work going on. So influenced by that music, everything I was doing was kind of quite shaped by it in terms of textures and colours, and the sort of slightly aggressive approach to painting that I still have now. And of course, throughout the whole period, it's interesting that, you know, with my love of horror films, that I could see the correlation with punk rock. That, as we know, the Damned were named after These Are the Damned, and Season of Banshees obviously after Cry of the Banshee, and so you kind of saw this little connection going on. And I guess the style of, for instance, Rocky Horror Picture Show very much was picked up with punk rock, and even film Cabaret, and there's sort of elements of horror in there, I guess, with sort of the Nazi Holocaust. So all these things kind of seem to match together quite well, and certainly with Lords of the New Church, a lot of their imagery was very horror-based. Obviously the Damned, Season of Banshees, a lot of their music had this horror element as well. And when at some point in the mid-80s, I think it was, I was asked to do a cover for video Return of the Living Dead. The reason they approached me was because on the soundtrack were the Damned and the Cramps, and so that was another little punk link for me, though, into the world of horror as well. So kind of, I guess it's really a whole combination of things, and it's interesting when you look back. I look back 40 years ago, trying to identify exactly what those signifiers were, and you know, the thing is, as a 16-year-old, I didn't get to see any of those early gigs at all. In fact, the first, you know, if you could call it punk rock even, gig I ever saw was a live performance of John Cougar Clarke, and that was in Southampton. And after that, I saw Essential Logic, who of course were the offshoot band from X-Ray Specs, Laura Logic on saxophone, that amazing kind of sound which made X-Ray Specs so unique. And I think probably when I was listening to other bands like Joy Division, that led on to bands like Killing Joke, and I remember seeing Joy Division's last London show, and Killing Joke was supporting. It kind of really introduced me to their music as well, with you know, the Fire Eater on stage as well, which is very visual as well, and kind of just snowballed from there, really. The one thing I've never done is played in a band, and that's just one of those odd things I kind of regret, but that's not really my skill anyway, though. And it's that odd thing that everybody says, well, nobody could play, but of course people could play, and if they couldn't initially, certainly they picked up pretty fast. And I think if I'd really plugged at it, then you know, things may have been different. Certainly I would have loved to have been part of that music, whole musical movement, as opposed to just the visual side of it. But you know, I think the work I do, the spirit of punk still lives on through the paint work anyway, though, and my approach to everything is still very much from that era, and the colours I use and textures are all still there. And even now when I'm painting, you know, I'll still be listening to music of that era, because to me it's still the most theatrical and liberating music that I know. That you know, we can talk about other influences from maybe the 50s, and I know Link Wray had a big impact on punk rock as well, and particularly with bands like Adam Nance and the Cramps as well. And you know, all these other things feed into it. And you know, you look at Screaming Jay Hawkins, perhaps, and Screaming Lord Such. All these kind of mad, eccentric people, all kind of fed into that whole kind of swamp, if we like, of music and inspiration. And you know, to me, it's endlessly inspiring and fascinating. And you know, all those people that you know from that period are still have this kind of magical spark. They're still really inspired, and it's just some little wonderful moment in time, I guess, though. And it's not a question of being nostalgic even, though, because I certainly have no nostalgia for that era in terms of, you know, Britain at the time was just absolutely revolting, and in so many ways. And you know, from the sort of industrial situation, the fuel strikes, the sort of just the sheer hell of it, and the overt racism, which was like really nasty. I mean, the National Front were you know, gaining grounds in many ways, and you know, it's very horrible to see people being beaten up. And Rock Against Racism obviously was a big movement, which was inspired by punk rock, and you know, culminating in a fantastic gig at the Alexandra Palace with the Slits and X-Ray Specs, the Clash. So quite fantastic. It was. I don't think the initial roots of punk rock in its musical movement were actually political, although it became quite politicised, because I think it was necessary to be so in order for it to actually, those messages to actually get through, and actually just take a stand and say, actually, we do think this is wrong, and this is our music, and how we're going to deal with that wrongness. And so I think the Clash obviously took on the politics, but it's interesting that Pistols were never political. I don't think X-Ray Specs were never political. The Buzzcocks, Cramps certainly weren't. The Damned, I don't think, had any overt politics at the time. Later on, I think stuff began to creep in, because Captain Sensible obviously is quite passionate about his politics, and rightly so. So I guess it's more the mature side of punk is really where the politics lie. But I think there's still a lot to be said for the very simple excitement and expression of just this mix of colour and sound and excitement, and just this slightly naughty sense behind it as well. Though it's very much a naughty kind of little bubblegum, bubble blowing kind of child behind there, and it's all part of its fascination, I think. Yeah, so it's interesting how things keep coming back. When I was working with Lord's New Church, so Stiv Bators and Brian James in particular, Stiv was the ideas man, but Brian still had a very visual, strong sense about how he wanted things to look. And so while Stiv might drive the initial ideas, Brian was always there with his kind of concepts as well. And so over the years, I've been working again with Brian on his solo work, and indeed went to see him the other week at a celebration of the Damned's first gig at the 100 Club, and it's great seeing Brian still on good form, thrashing away on guitar, still with that energy. It's like quite amazing, really. And other bands, well, it's every now and again something will pop up, and with a connection to their past, and certainly a lot of the musicians at the time have if they're not playing music so much now, they're certainly working in the creative industries anyway. Though, I mean, most of them seem to be artists, it seems, and I'll bump into Spiz quite often, Gay Black, Gay Advert, my friend Billy Chainsaw, who ran the fan club for Susan the Banshees all those years ago. So all these characters are still around, and we do keep colliding, it seems. And I remember when I first moved to London, I was living in West Hampstead, and there was a club called the Moonlight Club, Moonlight Room, beneath the Railway Tavern there, and I think Joy Division had played there perhaps about a month before I'd moved in. But I remember seeing the first ever Nick Cave, my first experience with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, well, obviously the birthday party at the time, and you used to go there and have drinks in the bar upstairs, and you'd see Paul Cook, Helen of Troy, all these interesting characters from that era. Spiz would be hanging out there as well, and it's just quite odd. And thinking about it, there's only 4 years after that initial explosion of punk rock, and 4 years now seems like 5 minutes really, but at the time for me, those 4 years were a very long period, and it's almost as if that was their long gone past, but of course, a very short amount of time had elapsed. Which just kind of showed how quickly it came and went as well, though. But again, it's just odd. You kind of go to see anniversary shows, the 20th anniversary, 30th anniversary, 40th anniversary. No doubt there'll be a 50th, and these guys will get up on stage and carry on doing it. But yeah, it's this incredible staying power. If nothing else, just this energy which kind of stays with people and keeps them quite youthful. I mean, even the flesh might be deceptive, but inside, these are like powerful people still. The term punk rock, it's a difficult one. I know with the different origins that people posit, and I think for me it's almost heinous to say. I know that the Stranglers were never considered punk rock in many ways, and certain people will actually be quite quite forthright about it. They'll just say, look, this band existed before punk rock, and thus they cannot be punk rock. But I remember seeing Stranglers on Top of the Pops. The song Peaches wasn't allowed to be played because of its content, which of course seems very tame now, but they performed the A-side, the other A-side, which was Go Buddy Go, and it's probably the most amazing performance I'd ever seen on Top of the Pops. this really dull, horrible show, and then suddenly the Stranglers were on, and it kind of just blew everything else away, and that was really the moment when I knew that this is the music that I really loved. And I think I'd heard the term punk rock, and I'd seen images of Jordan outside of the shop Sex, as it was at the time, And to me, her hair reminded me of Bride of Frankenstein, and Stranglers always had this kind of very dark, kind of gothic look to them as well. I mean, the first album, Rattus Norvegicus, had a rat on the back, and they're standing in this kind of weird kind of hall with sort of taxidermy and odd, weirdy things around them, and it was fascinating for me. And I remember just constantly sketching this image of what I consider to be punk rockers with a backdrop of Gothic castles. For some reason I just saw them as one and the same. So for me, punk rock, I think, was this kind of weird otherness, this kind of way of looking, way of being in this kind of parallel world. Certainly that was my interpretation, and it's still one that I kind of stick with now, because for me it works better than any kind of idea about a nickname for people in prison, or kind of useless, bum in the street or whatever, or rent boy, whatever term that people will assign to it. For me, punk rock is this other parallel place of being, which actually slips into the reality as well, and it's a reality which I've kind of made a living out of in many ways, just trying to put it down in two-dimensional form with the colours and the brush work. And so my work is kind of two-dimensional punk, if you like, though. It's visual punk as opposed to oral punk. So yeah, I guess my work in the field of horror is my punk rock. Well, I mentioned John Cooper Clarke, and I think probably of the bigger bands of the time, having seen John Cooper Clarke and Essential Logic, I think probably it was only when I moved to London that I started seeing the bands I really loved. So Susie and the Banshees probably would be the first major act I saw on stage at the Hammersmith Palais, and that would have been around the time of Kaleidoscope. And yeah, it was quite wonderful. Although I do remember that there was still this issue with this kind of dodgy National Front kind of racist thing going on for some, it's a hangover obviously from when Susie and a few of the punks used to wear a swastika armband. I mean, there's a little rebellion against the past that we dare not speak about. It's like, well, why not? Here it is, it's only an armband. But a lot of people took that quite literally, so even in those early gigs that I saw, you'd get these people at the front zeke-heiling. It's just quite bizarre, and it would infuriate Susie, and Banks would inevitably come along and move along people, but you could see there was still this very violent undercurrent. And even probably seeing Public Image at Brixton Academy, it had been about 1986, I think, though. They were promoting the album, and I just remember it being the atmosphere being really quite aggressive and unpleasant, and you kind of would see people wandering past with bleeding noses and black eyes, and things were being thrown at the stage, and you could see John Lydon getting really angry, and actually storming off at one point, just saying, this is it, you've had it, you don't deserve this, you deserve nuclear war, you really do. And I kind of thought, oh yeah, that's a bit much, but anyway, he did come back on. And then the atmosphere did calm down a bit, but literally there were bottles flying. It was just incredible, really. Not at all pleasant, although the music was absolutely fantastic, and certainly the energy created, a lot of it being negative, but the band would take it and turn it back on the audience, and so it became a very angry but weirdly exciting experience. And then since then, just catching all these amazing bands like The Damned, who I still stick with now. I know that there's this issue about The Damned, the original Damned, the Damned as they are now. But the thing is, I love both. As simple as that. And as a punter, you have that option to like whatever you like anyway. Though, so I'm not going to be purist about the music at all. I'll happily watch, Brian and Rat bashing out the original album, but I'll happily see Dave and Captain churning out the new stuff as well, though, which equally I love.